Welcome back to The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Callistra Faria. The conflict in the Middle East continues between Hamas and Israel. The death toll now reported to be more than 10,000 people, a lot of them civilians. We're discussing this matter. We've been discussing it for about a month now. What is happening there? Some have called it a genocide of the Palestinian people at the hands of Israel. Others have talked about an apartheid state that exists there and racism. There are a lot of issues at play, and Israel claiming that they have the right to defend themselves, and no one disputing that. However, the question of the bombings that have been taking place, as well as the settlers who have also been using violence against the Palestinian people, is of a major question. Joining me on The Narrative now to discuss this issue, I'll also try to get his views on the visit to the Middle East by the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken, is Dr. Dawood Abdullah, who is the Director of the Middle East Monitor based in London. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
As we woke up this morning, more bad news. Israel continues to intensify their military action. They seem to be heading to Gaza City. More than 10,000 reported dead. How should the world be reacting to this, what's unfolding before our eyes right now?
I think that there should be some form of intervention from the international community at this time. You mentioned the figure of 10,000. The fact of the matter is 70% of those are women and children. Many are babies, in fact. So there should be some form of intervention. Are we waiting to see another scenario that we saw in Rwanda? It's quite likely, because the way this conflict has unfolded is that the United States and its Western allies have given Israel a blank check, a green card, a green light to go ahead and do whatever it wants, irregardless of international law. And this cannot continue. It's appalling. I think the world should react with utter indignation. Some officials in the United Nations, in fact, have resigned because of this, because they know Israel is acting disproportionately and indiscriminately, and it follows a pattern. There's a script written here. Before all of this happened, as you mentioned, there were targeted attacks on civilians in the West Bank. Churches were violated, mosques were violated, olive trees were uprooted, and people they were actually referring to the Palestinians as animals. We have to know that when you hear an occupier, a colonialist, refer to you as an animal, that is the precedent for dehumanizing you. That's the pretext. And we saw it in Rwanda. The Tutsis were called cockroaches today, and they called them cockroaches for 1 year, between 1993 and 1994. And then we saw the genocide. If we are not careful, we're going to see a similar situation, tragically, in Palestine.
Now, there's always talk Israel has the right to defend itself, but really the history of this area, this territory there, is an interesting one. Peter Wickham, a regional pollster and analyst, was on my program, and he said, imagine the Caribs showing up in Grenada and saying, that house you're living in, I used to be here 2,000 years ago. Half of it belongs to me, or all of it belongs to me. So you need to get out. And a lot of what is happening, the Palestinians have had to face a lot of that. Do you think also Israel is hoping that they can clear the territory of Palestinians so that they can continue their settlement?
I don't think it's possible in the 21st century. I mean, it happened in 1948 when 3/4 of the Palestinian population were ethnically cleansed. But we have a new generation, And the world has changed. You have, social media, internet, etc. People are seeing what is happening on the ground, and that is why you have, demonstrations all the way from Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur down to Brasilia in South America. The world has awakened to this tragedy. What we've seen here is a military occupation, you see, that has lasted for 7 decades. People cannot go to their farms peacefully. They cannot go to the even,
They
and
can't
one of the
fish peacefully. They can't get the access to the marine
precisely,
resources. Yeah.
one of the misconceptions, in the West is that, well, this is a Muslim Jewish problem. It has nothing to do with this. It's a colonial problem, a settler colonial project imposed by the Europeans on these people. And the Palestinians compromised in 1993. They agreed to give Israel 78% of their land and remain on the net, on the other 22, and they're not satisfied. They still want, and they say, well, okay, this is Judea and Samaria. God gave it to us. That's the rationale, So, how much more can a people take? It's just too much. So the question of right to defense, self-defense, not when you are an occupier, not when you occupying someone's land, and this is what is happening.
And how do you
Sorry,
explain? How do you explain? Or how do they explain? Also, for recently, a few days ago, bombing the refugee camp. I think it's at Jabalaya, and
Jabala.
to go after a Hamas commander, one guy that they weren't sure they were even
Yes.
going to get, and they bombed a refugee camp. That sort of, how does Israel get away with those kinds of optics in the world?
Because America is supporting them, and Britain and Germany and France, they all supporting them. You see, these people suffer from the guilt complex. They persecuted the Jews in Europe, and they had the Holocaust in Europe, not in the Middle East. The Palestinians had nothing to do with it. You see, but they persecuting them today. And the Americans and the Brits and the French, they upholding it, you see, in the name of civilization. What civilization is this? Netanyahu was talking about a conflict between barbarism and colonialism and civilization. There's nothing civilized about this. And mind you, this is the same discourse that we had in the 19th century when it started. When the founder of the Zionist movement launched his project in Basel in 1897, he said this: we're going to bring civilization to a barbaric part of the world. And today Netanyahu is saying this. President, the late Nelson Mandela called them political dinosaurs. They just live in another era. You see, that's it.
And that sort of language, we're going to bring civilization to a barbaric people, is a lot like the language that was used in the conquering and colonization of Africa.
Precisely the so-called white man's burden, that the white man has this responsibility to bring civilization to the world.
And,
But what
and,
did
and,
they
and,
do?
and what the Amerindians endured as well, and they were wiped out. It was genocide for the
Exactly.
Amerindians, the native Indians in the Caribbean and
So
South and Central America. Yeah.
this is settler colonialism through and through. See, but its method is violent. It is unrestricted in terms of its methods. And unfortunately, the countries that preach democracy, they and human rights, they are upholding this. When Russia went into Ukraine, they said the Ukrainians should resist, and it was noble and legal to resist Russian occupation. In Palestine, to resist occupation, which by the way is 7 decades old, is illegal, and it's terrorism, and it's dishonorable. That's how that's the double standards, the duplicity that we get in the media every day.
And what
And
they
from the
maintain, what they maintain is that they're doing this. This is a fight against Hamas. They're trying to root out a terrorist organization, but Hamas, its genesis is closely connected to Israel.
Not really. I mean, Israel tries to present this to the world. Hamas emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was formed in 1928 in Egypt. It's an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel just gave them a license to operate under the occupation in the 1980s, but they were not the founders, of Hamas. Hamas is from the Muslim Brotherhood. But the fact is, they're not from the moon, they're not from Mars, they are Palestinians, you see, and they believe that they have a right to resist the occupation. That's the crux of the matter. They're not going to surrender and let all their land be taken away from them or be driven into the Sinai. Now they're trying to force the Egyptians to accept the 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza in the Sinai desert. And I say to you, the 80% of the people in Gaza, they are refugees themselves from southern Israel, what is now called Israel, in villages and towns in what is Israel. They were driven out in 1948 and they settled in Gaza. Now they want to come back and take Gaza and push them into the Sinai. Where is it going to stop? And in the West Bank, they're saying the people in the West Bank must go to the east, to Jordan, that Jordan is their home. You see? This is an expansionist.
And in all of this, no one has thought, let's just live together.
Of course not. Of course not. I mean, people want to live in peace and dignity and have freedom. Like, if, when in the 1960s, when we had the decolonization process in Africa, all the resolutions which spoke about the independence for Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, those resolutions included Palestine. All of these countries have had their independence, are on their way to development. But Palestine remains under occupation. And this is why President Mandela said, our freedom is not complete until Palestine is free. And,
Now,
and, and
go ahead.
now, mentioned in South Africa, I mean, the whole, and you mentioned it in your intro, the question of apartheid. Reverend Desmond Tutu, who was regarded as the conscience of the anti-apartheid movement, when he went to Palestine, he said, what I see here is worse than what we experienced in South Africa in the darkest days of apartheid. This Reverend Desmond Tutu speaking. The discrimination, the segregation, the violence and denial of basic fundamental rights is so stark, so apparent, that anyone could see it.
Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he was just there. He ended his visit there several hours ago, I think. And one of the things he was pushing for is a pause in hostilities, a
Yeah,
humanitarian pause. Israel has said absolutely not. We're not going to stop the guns. We're not going to stop the
yeah,
bombs so that medicine and food and fuel and so can get through to the
yeah,
non-combatants. Uh,
yeah.
is, is there any violation there of international law?
Of course. I mean, if you listen to the UN Human Rights Commission, they're all saying this. And this is why the gentleman last week, one of the senior officials in New York, he resigned because these are blatant breaches, violations of international humanitarian law. Even in war, there are rules. There are rules in war. You don't kill women, you don't kill babies, you don't kill children, you don't bomb hospitals and ambulances and mosques and churches. This is what they're doing.
You don't kill members of the press either.
Exactly,
And that has
exactly,
happened a lot. I think it's over
exactly.
30 or so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is a free for all. Yeah, and he thanks to the West, thanks to those who uphold democracy and human rights in Washington and in London and Paris, you see, with their guilt for the Holocaust. So because
And you say that with tone and cheek, don't you, Professor?
of
Don't you,
course,
Doctor
of,
Abdullah?
of, of course, they,
Just in case
because,
anyone does not get it.
yeah, yeah,
But another thing that Secretary of State Blinken was pushing for, which I understand other nations in the region, kind of gave him a hard no on it, was that to begin to look at a post-Hamas Palestine, and they're
Yeah.
saying this is not where we are right now. People are dying. There's a
Yeah.
humanitarian crisis. People are suffering. This is not where we are. Is is the U.S. and that might be kind of like an obvious question that we've just finished talking about. Is the U.S.
Yeah.
priority skewed on this?
It, it, the U.S. priority is Israel, its security, and all the rest of it. And it's a client state. President Biden said recently, if there wasn't an Israel, we would have created one. But the fact of the matter is, it
But
was
what's the purpose?
created.
What's the purpose? Why is Israel so important? Is it,
It, it's
is this the client state in a hotbed area, the Middle East, where they feel like they need this there to? What's the purpose?
Geostrategically, geostrategically, it's almost in the center of the world, at the crossroad of the Europe, Asia, and Africa. So when Britain sponsored this project in the early 20th century, India was the pearl of the British crown. So they had to get to India. You had to, the safe and quickest way to India was through this part of the world. So it was strategically important for Britain to have a client state there. Today, America stockpiles its weapons in Israel. So if it wants to attack any country in Asia, it goes to Israel and use what is stacked there. You see, but there's also a question of resources off the coast of Gaza, the area where we're fighting today, or where there is fighting. There is natural gas resources, huge natural gas resources, and the Palestinians not benefiting from it. Israel is taking it, and America will ensure, you see, that they continue to benefit from this the natural gas off the coast of Gaza.
Now, do we, when we look at all of the women and the children who are dying, a journalist receiving the news on air that his family, who were told to move to a safer zone, were moved there and were killed, is this situation, the way that Israel is handling this indiscriminate murder of non-combatants, is it only going to be counterproductive and to create more people who are upset with Israel, who are willing to take up arms against Israel, and who are willing to fight for the territory?
Exactly,
They're making more enemies, aren't they?
of course, the orphans, the widowers. How will they feel 5 years from now? You're absolutely right. And this is not something that happened today. So if you remember last week, the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, he said, well, what happened? There's a context to what happened on October the 7th. Let's look at the context. We only looking at the results. What are the
That didn't go
causes?
down very well either.
It didn't go down
That
well.
decision didn't go down very well. Yeah.
It didn't go down well. They called for his resignation. But you have to go to the causes, not just the results.
And this is, I mean, this goes back to Israel, formed in 1947 under the UN Charter, and then from 1948 you had this, as you call it, this colonial settler agenda that was being pushed,
Yes,
where people were
yes.
just being thrown out of places that they had lived for thousands of years.
When Balfour signed the declaration giving them the national home in Palestine, they constituted 3% of the population, 55,000. Under the British mandate, the number grew to 650,000. That's in 1948, when the land when the state of Israel was declared. From 55,000 within less than half a century. Thanks to Britain, it opened up the borders to them. And of course, what happened in Germany and other parts of Europe, they flooded into Palestine. But the Palestinians had nothing to do with the war. You see?
And in fact, there is a historical data to show that the Jews lived in harmony with the Arabs at various times.
Of course they did. Of course they did. And if you remember, when there was the Inquisition in Europe, when Spain, decided to take back its lands from the Muslim kingdoms in Europe and the Inquisition, many of the Jews went to Muslim lands, to Morocco, to Turkey. You see, they settled and they were welcomed. They were persecuted in Europe. They were welcome in Muslim lands.
Let's take a look at the Caribbean now. You, Dr. Abdullah, you're actually a Grenadian. We've been away for a long time, but the nutmeg is still belongs to you. Um,
Sure. Thank you.
the Caribbean, CARICOM, small block, but we have a voice.
Yeah.
Should CARICOM countries, I had the former President Donald Ramator of Guyana on my program a few days ago, and he said uh, the best show of solidarity that CARICOM can give to the people of Palestine is to cut ties with Israel,
Mhm.
cut any
I,
sort of
I,
diplomatic or trade ties with Israel. Uh, do you think that is something that could happen?
well, I recognize that our islands are small and poor, and we depend on a lot of aid, etc., from the countries in the north. But having said that, we should acknowledge that our countries voted last week in the UN overwhelmingly. Only one country I noticed, Jamaica, had
Jamaica, and
abstained, but they didn't
I'm gonna
attend.
get your thoughts about that afterwards. But go
They
ahead.
didn't attend, but all other countries, Cuba right down to Guyana, they all voted in support of the resolution. So I think the way forward for our islands and Guyana is to explore this issue of boycott. You know, Countries in Latin America are doing it. Bolivia cut ties, Chile cut ties, Colombia cut ties, and they are not rich countries, you see. And we are part of a broader network with our colleagues in South America. So sticking together, I think we can, as CARICOM, have an impact if we were to boycott the goods, the whatever they provide to the region, security services, etc. And mind you, when those countries that cooperate in security, they should remember that the policemen who brutalize our Afro-American brothers in America, who brutalize them and kill them on the streets they were trained in Israel. They were trained in Israel. So, we in the Caribbean should wake up and not entertain, that kind of conduct from our law enforcement officers. We can train ourselves differently, not to behave like animals and brutes.
No, Jamaica abstaining from the vote for a ceasefire. The only country in the Caribbean that did so. So it was very glaring. Um,
Mhm.
I picked up that they said there was a miscommunication when about about the vote coming up. Um, but uh, Jamaica is also one of the countries that went as individuals to meet Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Um, do you think that there's a sort of divide and conquer strategy that the
Well,
U.S. is trying to impose on our states within CARICOM?
Possibly, but from our history in the Caribbean, when we had the federation, it was the big countries who didn't want to carry the burden, so-called burden of the smaller islands, and so they went their own way. And unfortunately, this is a type of thinking I think we need to correct. We all came on the same boats from Africa. We all had 300 years of slavery. We were all subjected to brutality on the plantations. So there is ample reasons why we should cooperate, for the benefit, for the common good of all the Caribbean peoples.
Jamaica leads on foreign affairs for CARICOM. So,
Mhm.
and this is a big issue, the issue of Palestine and the conflict that's happening now, and they lead on that. So it was interesting to say the least that they missed the vote at that time. Do you think they were just trying to play it safe?
probably I really don't know, the ins and outs of the Jamaican politics in regard to Palestine, but I know that there has been a significant Jewish population in Jamaica, which probably, I don't know, probably have Zionist inclinations. And I make a distinction, mind you, between Jews as a people and Judaism as a religion and Zionism. Zionism is a racist colonial project. And that there was a time when Zionism was declared by the United Nations as racist and akin to apartheid. Uh, Up until 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, then that resolution was taken off the books. But historically, we all know that this ideology is fundamentally, anti. It's colonialist. It's racist in its nature. But
Dr.
that has
Dawood,
nothing to do with the Jews as a people and their faith. We must make this distinction very clear.
Dr. Dawood Abdullah, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me on The
That's all
Narrative.
right.
That's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you so much for being on the program. We look forward to having you back again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Callistra Fario, speaking there to Dr. Dawood Abdullah. This is The Narrative. I'm your storyteller, Callistra Fario, speaking there to Dr. Dawood Abdullah, who is the director of Middle East Monitor in London, discussing the the Israeli-Hamas conflict that has now claimed over 10,000 lives, the vast majority of them being non-combatants, a lot of women and children being affected. More when we come back.